Hey, thank you very much, John. Great introduction and great lead in. And thanks to Mike too for inviting me. Really appreciate speaking in front of your roundtable. It's a very prestigious roundtable in Europe. We're very well aware of it here in the United States. So thanks again, and much appreciate Eric's recommendation being taken up. Before I start, I want to mention something about Morgan's Great Raid. It's not the first time that this raid has been talked about. I don't know if you could see that very well, but it says this book is called Great Raids in History. It's written by Samuel A. Southworth, who edited it in 2002. It lists 18 great raids in world history, from Sir Francis Drake's raid on Cadiz, Spain, all the way up to the raid of the United States in Desert One. And Morgan's Great Raid is listed amongst those 18 great raids in world history. And it's one of the things that caught my attention when I started researching Morgan's Great Raid. Being in Cincinnati, I'd known about Morgan's Great Raid my entire life. It's a well-known subject here in the state of Ohio, where I live, but it's something that very little was known about it, and only a few books had been written on the raid itself. So I started looking deeper into this and found out a lot about why Morgan's Great Raid is one of the greatest raids in world history. And it makes sense, not so much from what it accomplished, but more so by how much it accomplished through its execution. So the execution is really what we want to look at here with Morgan's raid, and the success in the execution of a raid. I'd like to start you first with the background of why this raid took place in the first place. It started with this man, General Braxton Bragg, who was commander of the Army of Tennessee, which was the largest Confederate army west of the Appalachian Mountains. He controlled most of the territory between the Mississippi River and the Appalachians, which is a very, very large territory, the largest in the Confederacy. His problem was in June of 1863, which was the essentially the pinnacle of the Civil War. He was he was on his heels. The Confederacy in general in the West was on its heels, and he knew it. He was being confronted by two major Union armies directly, the Union Army of the Cumberland under General William S. Rosecrans, and also a brand new army called the Union Army of the Ohio, which was a reformed Army of the Ohio that had been disbanded and turned into the Army of the Cumberland in 1862. Now it was being reformed with new troops in Kentucky. And General Braxton Bragg realized that with two armies facing his own, he was greatly outnumbered, and there was a great chance that this new formed Army of the Ohio under a man named General Ambrose Burnside, who I'm talking about in just a second, would easily outflank Bragg's army on the eastern flank, or what we know as the Cumberland Gap Eastern Tennessee route. Eastern Tennessee was a direct route into Bragg's rear guard, particularly his supply base at Chattanooga, Tennessee. And if he lost Chattanooga, Tennessee, he would be forced to abandon all of Tennessee to the Union Army. So he authorized a raid to divert the attention of the Army of Ohio away from Kentucky. His primary target was the Army of the Ohio, and Major General Ambrose Burnside was commander of that army. He was actually stationed in Cincinnati, my hometown. Cincinnati was the headquarters for the Union Department of Ohio, which was the largest Union department in the Western Theater. Encompassed all the United States, north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi River, and it also encompassed most of Kentucky and part of Tennessee. So it was a very large area of the Union that was commanded by Ambrose Burnside, from which he recruited most of his army. And so his department was a key element to the success of the Union Army in the West. And Braxton Bragg faced full onslaught of this department. Now, Ambrose Burnside is probably more famous for being commander of the Army of the Potomac in December of 1862, when he was defeated by General Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia at the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862, and the subsequent um, failure of the Mud March, which led to his dismissal by President Abraham Lincoln from the command of the Army of the Potomac, which greatly left Ambrose Burnside dismayed and somewhat looking for redemption. And he would look at this raid as a way of giving him some redemption, showing that he could return to field command, because becoming commander of the Department of Ohio was really a desk job. He didn't like desk jobs. He wanted to be out in the field and earn the glory of being a field commander. We also know General Ambrose Burnside by those fuzzy whiskers on each side of his face. It is his name that lent the word sideburns to the English lexicon. In fact, because of him, Americans used to call those fuzzy whiskers that are on the side of the face Burnsides, but just like good Americans like to do, they switch things around and turned it into sideburns. So that's probably what he's best known today for. Now, when Braxton Bragg thought of a raid to divert Burnside's attention from Kentucky and Tennessee, he thought of this man first, Brigadier General John Hunt Morgan, mainly because Morgan had been a successful raider for nearly 2 years. He had done some extraordinary things with his small amount of troops in the state of Kentucky primarily, but also recently had defeated a large infantry brigade around Hartsville, Tennessee. And that led both Bragg and President Jefferson Davis to give him a lot of credit and a lot of faith in his capabilities. So when John Hunt Morgan proposed a raid into the state of Indiana, Ohio, Bragg was intrigued, but he immediately said, no, I can't afford for you to take your division of 2,500 cavalry across the Ohio River into the Union States, because there's a great chance that you lose your division, which I greatly need, but also it would prevent Morgan's division from supporting the flank of the Army of Tennessee, which is more important in Bragg's eyes. Keep in mind that raiding techniques that we use commonly today in our special forces are not something that West Point taught, not until after World War One. The thought of using cavalry as mounted infantry was more of an afterthought, and certainly using it for raiding was certainly a more of a special operation that they didn't really feel it was necessary. Most Union and Confederate generals felt raiding was not very effective and not useful for cavalry. Cavalry was more important to them for picketing and protecting the flanks. However, John Hunt Morgan had perfected the use of mounted infantry and using it for raiding purposes to stop or delay whole armies. And his men here, which we have a photograph of, this is from the 10th Kentucky Partisan Rangers, which was one of the regiments within Morgan's division of cavalry. They were by this time experts at raiding techniques using mounted infantry techniques. So these men were taught as infantrymen. They were not truly cavalrymen, even though they were designated as cavalry. They were truly mounted infantry. They fought like infantry on a battlefield, but they used horses as transport. And there were two generals of the Civil War who really used that to their advantage and really escalated in the United States into United States military doctrine. And that was Morgan and Nathan Bedford Forrest, whom Lee said at the end of the war was the best general in the Civil War, period. He gave Forrest a lot of credit for that. And it's interesting to know that Forrest and Morgan were very good friends. They often consulted many times on techniques because they shared a lot of the same vision how cavalry should be used, which was different from the rest of the Confederate Army. As John mentioned earlier, men like Jeb Stuart were not mounted infantry leaders. Jeb Stuart was a cavalry leader, true cavalry leader, um, and so on and so forth. And mainly because that's how cavalry leaders were taught. They were taught to use them as men to protect the flanks and pickets. But Morgan and Forrest taught their men to act as infantry, and horses were a speedy way of getting men into battle, a lot faster than the typical infantry that you see on the battlefield in the Civil War. These men were also expert raiders. And one of the things I want to point out in this picture, which is really interesting, all these men are officers. And you notice that some of them are wearing their officer's garb, like those in the middle, but those on the ends are wearing their, what I would call their raiding garb. They look like typical men you would see walking the streets of any town or city or village in the United States in the 1860s. These men were dressed in this garb to do one thing, and that's to embed themselves into the population in order to gather intelligence and to not risk um, that their particular location is revealed as an enemy location to the Union Army. So they really use this as a disguise, as a way of getting intelligence without being recognized by the population as Confederate soldiers. Now, one could say in the 1860s that this was an issue, that they were out of uniform and therefore they were spies. But by 1863, this was something that generally the Confederates were known for anyway, because many of the infantrymen and cavalrymen and artillerymen in the Civil War by this time in the Confederate Army could not afford to have uniforms. So many of them wore homespun in battle. So it was not unusual for a Confederate soldier to be seen in civilian outfits. So Morgan took advantage of that and used that to get intelligence without revealing that they were Confederate soldiers. These two men were Morgan's specialists, and they were also his direct reports. Colonel Basil Duke and Adam Stovepipe Johnson were both brigade commanders in Morgan's division of 2 brigades. Colonel Basil Duke on the left was Morgan's brother-in-law. He actually had 4 brothers in his division, and Duke was his brother-in-law who had married his General Morgan's youngest sister before the war. Basil Duke was also Morgan's right-hand man. He was the tactician of the division. He was also the disciplinarian. Morgan tended to be very open and somewhat flamboyant in his use of cavalry, and Morgan's more known for his brash and daring and his ability to take risk, whereas Basil Duke was more of a conservative, more of a person that would say, don't take this risk because of this reason, and Morgan would take that into account. So Basil Duke and Morgan was one of the best combinations, one of the best pairings of the Civil War, much like Grant and Sherman were one of the great pairings of the Civil War, or for that matter, you could say Lee and Longstreet. These were great pairings of leadership in the Civil War because they complemented each other in their thinking. So Basil Duke and Morgan created a great pairing when it came to raiding techniques. And these raiding techniques are ones that we know today, as special operations. We use them constantly in warfare today, raiding behind enemy lines to destroy infrastructure, cause consternation with the enemy's rear guard, to the point where the army is stymied. The enemy army cannot move because of what the raiders are doing. And that was Morgan's intent the entire time with this raid, was to stop progression of the Army of Ohio into Kentucky or East Tennessee. That Adam Stovepipe Johnson was one of those who was an expert at this too. He actually was a partisan ranger. He had formed the 10th Kentucky Partisan Rangers, who were part of Morgan's division. And he was also the first Confederate leader to capture a Union City in the Civil War. He had captured Newburgh, Indiana, which was on the north bank of the Ohio River in Indiana, a Union state, in July of 1862. And he had used 40 men to do it. And he got his nickname Stovepipe from that action by disguising tree trunks on wagon wheels as cannon, and he called for the surrender of the Union commander of Newburgh, which was a small Union outpost, by saying, "We'll blow you guys to smithereens if you don't surrender your town." And when the Union commander saw these fake cannon across the way that looked like real cannon to him because of the distance, he immediately surrendered to Stovepipe Johnson. Hence, that's why Adams Johnson received his nickname Stovepipe. He was very well known for raiding techniques that would be perfect for Morgan's division, and hence that's why General Morgan selected him as his second brigade commander. So the problem with this raid, though, is Bragg authorizes the raid to be made in Kentucky only. However, Morgan, being a brash commander, somewhat flamboyant, and very much independent thinking, which is what a special operations commander today is taught to be. He's a special operations commander today must be independent thinking, and he must teach his men to work independently, so that if when they're in pairs or even singly, they can make decisions that make sense to themselves to extricate themselves or accomplish the mission. That's how he taught his men. That's how he taught him, his officers, and it's also how he thought with respect to his superiors. And Morgan feels that staying in Kentucky will not accomplish the mission of diverting the Army of the Ohio away from Tennessee. He can be there maybe a week at most before the Union cavalry would surround him and force him out of Kentucky, which would not delay the Army of the Ohio long enough for Braxton Bragg to solidify his position in Middle Tennessee. So Morgan decides to disobey Bragg's orders, which is a no-no in the Army, of course. He's going to put himself in a position where he could easily be court-martialed. But Morgan decides he's going to take his division of 2,500 men with 4 artillery cannon that are the same as those used by infantry. He's going to take them into Kentucky, and then his goal is to cross the Ohio River somewhere near Louisville, Kentucky, which was a major supply base for the Union Army in the West. Practically all the supplies going to the Union Army came through Louisville. So he would use Louisville to his advantage, not as a target, but rather as a way of putting Burnside into the thought that Louisville was the target, but he would use it as a feint and get around Louisville and be able to cross the Ohio River without the U.S. Navy getting involved, or without the U.S. Army preventing him from crossing the Ohio River. So this was only known to one person when the raid started, and that was Basil Duke, his best friend, his brother-in-law, his right-hand man. Only he was trusted with this information that Morgan was going to disobey orders. And of course, Duke, being the conservative, tried to talk him out of it. But then when Morgan's eyes lit up and said, "This is going to change the war forever," Duke realized that no matter what he said, Morgan was going to execute this raid into Indiana, Ohio. First time that Confederate soldiers of this largest size would enter the state of Indiana or the state of Ohio. It had not been done in the Civil War up to this point, because as you remember, the raids prior to this were a lot smaller in size. Less than 100 men entered the state of Indiana prior to this on 2 different occasions, one of which was the Johnson raid on Newburgh. But now he's going to take an entire division cavalry with artillery into these states, which had never been done before. So it was definitely a major choice, and one that would put Morgan into disfavor with Bragg and also with President Jefferson Davis. The raid officially starts on July 2nd. When people study this raid, you'll often find books that say it started on June 11th, which is incorrect. When you study raids in general, raids don't begin until the enemy lines are crossed. And the enemy line at this point was stationed at the Cumberland River. That's where everything north of the Cumberland River, which is down here at the bottom of the map, you will see Burkesville and Albany. Well, Burkesville is on the Cumberland River, and everything north of that was fully controlled Union territory. There was a no man's land between Burkesville and south of there to Murfreesboro, which was no man's land. But really, everything north of the Cumberland River was Union territory, fully secured by Union soldiers. Though Kentucky was a neutral state, it was mostly Unionist, and so it was not hard to make Kentucky a Union occupied state. So everything north of the Cumberland River, Morgan knew he would have to fight Union troops. And more importantly, he would have to fight Union militia, which would add a new wrinkle to this whole idea of raiding behind enemy lines. Up to this point, he had really been concentrating on fighting Union regular troops under the Army of the Ohio or the Army of the Cumberland. The primary Army of the Ohio commander in that area of Burkesville, Kentucky, was Brigadier General Henry M. Judah. And he was an alcoholic. He was a known alcoholic. He had almost been kicked out of the U.S. Army prior to the Civil War at Fort Yuma in Arizona when he was drunk on duty. And his fellow officers had seen him do this several times, and they were fed up with it, and they were about to court-martial him when the Civil War broke out, and they needed everybody they could get. So Henry Judah was actually promoted to brigadier general. He had fought in the Corinth campaign in 1862 as a officer working with General Henry Halleck. He earned the favor of General Henry Halleck, even though Judah was a known alcoholic. For some reason, he was able to convince his superiors that he was okay to be in the field. Well, unfortunately, it would show up again here in Great Raid, and General Henry Judah was not inebriated when Morgan first crossed the the Cumberland River on July 2nd. However, he soon became inebriated after Morgan was successful in doing so, because crossing the Cumberland River was one of Morgan's first of four major objectives in order to accomplish the raid he wanted. He had to get across the Cumberland River into Union territory. Then he had to cross the Ohio River. That was the second objective. Third objective was to get around Cincinnati, which was the seventh largest city in the United States at the time. Was also the largest Union city west of the Appalachian Mountains. And then he had his fourth objective, Morgan's fourth objective, was to get back across the Ohio River so he could return to Confederate territory. Now, Judah was in charge of that first objective, defending that first objective, and he made some terrible mistakes, allowing Morgan to easily cross the river over the course of July 1st through 2nd. And finally, Morgan was completely in Union territory by the night of July 2nd into the early morning of July 3rd. And Judah became a scapegoat for Burnside for allowing this to happen so easily. And so that is something that followed Judah for the rest of his career. Now, the first battle to occur, or first major fight, I would call it, of this campaign of Morgan was on July 4th, which is U.S. Independence Day, of course, and the Battle of Ted's Bend occurred on this date. Morgan, by this time, was very overconfident. I would say that was one of his Achilles' heels. He was confident enough to take his men deep into Union territory, which was necessary as a special operations commander. But he often did things that were unnecessary, and this was one of those. When you look at his career, this is probably one of the worst things he ever did. The Battle of Ted's Bend. He attacked an entrenched Union position of 5 companies of the 25th Michigan Infantry, and he didn't have to do it. His whole goal was to really capture this position, but he didn't have to capture this position to make his raid a success. All he had to do is cross the Green River, which was down there on the bottom left of this map. You could see he could actually outflank the position and cross the Green River by a ford. In July of 63 was a very dry summer, so most of these rivers in Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio were at very low levels, easy enough for Confederate cavalry and even artillery to get across fords. And that's what he could have done and completely avoided this battle. But instead, he attacked it directly, And um, Colonel Moore gave Morgan a licking here. Morgan's position is seen here in this actual photograph of the Battle of Tuds Bend. Morgan was in the distance there on that ridge on the distance, and his men attacked to our forefront right here, right in the foreground was where the Union line was located. And this entrenched position could not be penetrated by Morgan's men who were fighting as infantry here. They were not fighting on horseback. They were actually fighting as infantrymen would. And they charged the position multiple times. Each charge was brutally repulsed. Morgan lost several very valuable officers, including Colonel Chenot of the 11th Kentucky Cavalry, one of his most experienced cavalry leaders within his division. He also lost some very valuable junior officers who had risen through the ranks. This was a disaster for Morgan. It was his worst battle in his career up to this time. And many of his men took this as a sign, a negative sign that something's wrong about this raid. It's not going well from the start. But Morgan was able to eventually figure out the best thing he should have done in the first place is just outflank position and cross the Green River and move on to the north, which he did. Now, this battle occurred the next day, and it was necessary. Morgan was not carrying a long wagon train to supply his troops. His men were living off the land, something his men had learned over the 3 years of the Civil War, or 2 years up to that point, that his men did better when they were traveling light. So much like we see in the Vicksburg campaign with Grant, and also in the March to the Sea with Sherman, the men were living off the land. They were living from civilians, but they did need to resupply their ammunition. And this place offered a warehouse full of guns and ammunition. Lebanon was a Union supply depot for the Army of the Cumberland, and it was a good target for Morgan's men to try to take, and they did so successfully, but not until after a very stiff fight with fellow Kentuckians under Colonel Hanson, who was a Union commander, but his brother was a Confederate brigade commander who was killed at the Battle of Stones River earlier in 1863. Hanson fought tooth and nail to keep this place. And Hanson was personal friend of Morgan prior to the Civil War. So this is truly a brother against brother battle. Many of the men in the 20th Kentucky Union Infantry were brothers, cousins, relatives of some sort of men in Morgan's division. So they were fighting each other, family versus family in this fight. It became very brutal. It became very emotional. At one point, Morgan lost his younger brother, Tom, in this fight. He was shot through the heart and died immediately, and it caused a ripple effect throughout Morgan's division when Tom was killed, to the point where they were threatening to kill Union prisoners after Morgan's troops had captured the town and captured the 20th Kentucky. Morgan had to step in with tears in his eyes and raised his pistols up in the air and says, "The first man who shoots a prisoner, I will shoot him down." So that stopped the whole bloodletting and threats against the Union prisoners. But that was a case where shows how Morgan treated his prisoners. He treated them very well, to the point that will come back and help him in future after he becomes a prisoner of war. And this is the site of the Battle of Lebanon, and the depot, which was the site of the last fight of the battle, occurred right where that open space is to the left of the red minivan there in the middle. The building in the center, right above the red minivan with the blue awning, that's an actual building that survived the battle and still stands today when you visit the battlefield. Now, Burnside was unhappy with Hobson, who was the general commander of Union cavalry in the area of Western Kentucky for the Army of the Ohio. So he allowed General Edward Hobson, who was the underling for General Judah, to take commander of command of a new division of cavalry formed on the spot called the Provisional Division. This is a division of about 2,500 men, about the same size as Morgan's division, and they would be the ones that would pursue Morgan through Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio. They would do the brunt of the pursuit. So it would be Hobson who would win the laurels of this raid in the end. And Hobson did a great job doing it. He was a superior commander. He was a fellow Kentuckian, and he knew Morgan's antics very well. So he had learned from being the victim of Morgan's of tricks and knowledge of good raiding techniques. He had learned to become a good raider himself, and he would use that to his advantage here. And Hobson's brigade commanders in the provisional division were some of the best officers to combat Morgan's men. Colonel August Kautz, who had come from the eastern campaigns and moved to the west to combat men like Forrest and Morgan. August Kautz would later be a great raider himself and eventually a leader in the whole U.S. Army in the United States in the West after the Civil War. So August Kautz was a very well-trained Union cavalry officer. And then we have General James Shackelford in the middle. He was the superior of the three here, but he gave up his superiority over Hobson to allow Hobson to be his superior commander for this raid. So he's a very generous man. He was very good with his troops. He was very strict, but he was a great leader. And again, James Shackelford had been the victim of Morgan's antics in the first 2 years of the war. He knew and had some kind of vengeance behind him because at one point he lost the use of his foot in a fight with Adam Rankin Johnson in 1862. So James Shackelford had a chip on his shoulder in this raid. And then finally on the right is Colonel Frank Wolford, commander of the 1st Kentucky U.S. Cavalry. He is one of the best cavalry officers in the Western Theater. His troops are some of the best trained cavalrymen and cavalry officers in the West. They are truly this group here, including Frank Wolford, is the greatest fear Morgan has. His men, if they feared anything, they never feared militia, but they feared these men, and they really much feared the cavalrymen who were reporting to these officers, and therefore, if there was any fear at all with Morgan, it was Hobson's provisional division. And this is one of the men in Hobson's provisional division, just one of many who look so innocent here, but by 1863, these men were grizzled vets, including Private Franklin Ackley of Company E, 2nd Ohio Cavalry, who belonged to Kautz's brigade. This is a typical Union soldier who had gone from being the butt of jokes to being some of the best cavalrymen on North American soil. And the first major barrier, as I mentioned, was crossing the Ohio River to the north, and that worked out very well. And mainly because of Morgan's antics, he used his men who were clothed in civilian outfits to lead the John T. McCoons, which was a typical civilian steamboat that would ply the rivers of the Ohio River back and forth between St. Louis and Louisville. He used them to flag them down like you would flag down a cab. And back in those days, you could flag down a steamboat, and they would, for a fee, carry you to the next city. And so John T. McComb's captain was unaware that Morgan was so close because everybody thought Morgan was near Louisville, which was 27 miles upstream. So there was no clue that there was any danger here. And the John T. McCombs came up and carried these men on board, and then all of a sudden they brandished pistols and pointed them at the captain of the John T. McCombs and says, "This ship is now in the command of the Confederate States of America, and you will relinquish it to us." And of course, the captain did not offer any resistance. And so the John T. McCombs all of a sudden became a Confederate States steamboat. And the same happened when they brought the John T. McCombs out in the middle of the river. they put up a distress signal to lure the Allistene's captain to help them out. The Allistene came alongside the John T. McCombs, and the same thing happened again. The Confederate scouts jumped onto the Allistene, brandished their guns, and captain of the Allistene surrendered it. So now all of a sudden there's two steamboats to allow Morgan to transport his troops, his horses, his artillery across the river to Indiana. And over the course of a day, he was able to get them across the river successfully, even after fighting a U.S. Navy gunboat, the USS Springfield, which had come down from Louisville. The good thing is that Morgan had artillery that was actually better than the artillery that the Springfield had on it, because the Springfield had smoothbore artillery. Morgan's artillery were rifled artillery and had better range and more accuracy. And the Springfield was beaten when they attempted to stop the crossing. It was a very interesting fight, being that it was a river crossing contested by both the U.S. Navy and Indiana militia. And the Indiana militia fled pretty much at the first fire of the artillery, which was typical of the Indiana militia fights in the North. Morgan's great raid through Indiana started on July 9th after the crossing at Brandenburg on the bottom left of the map. And then he traveled 165 miles through the state up to Harrison, Ohio, where he had crossed into the state of Ohio. During this 165-mile raid of the state of Indiana, he did little more than just keep moving. He did destroy some infrastructure along the way, some railroad bridges, some warehouses, occasionally captured some Union militia, but for the most part, it was very little was accomplished on the infrastructure side. It was mainly, you could almost say, Morgan was acting like the fox to the Union hound. He was diverting Union troops away from Kentucky by moving them back north. And now, Provisional Division under Hobson, 2,500 Union cavalrymen, very seasoned cavalrymen, they represented a large portion of the Army of the Ohio's cavalry that would be used in the invasion of East Tennessee. By having these men move away from Kentucky and back toward the rear into the state of Indiana would prevent and stymie the Army of Ohio from moving into East Tennessee. And it was working perfectly. But in order to do that, Morgan had to act like the fox to the hound, where the hound is Hobson and the fox is Morgan. And he did it very well. But to do this, and this is the execution portion that Southworth talked about, Morgan was moving at a pace of 21 hours in the saddle per day. That means, on average, his men were getting only 3 hours of sleep per day. And his horses were being worn out maybe 3 times a day. They would have to replace their horses, and they would replace them with civilian horses. And by doing so, he would leave a trail of half-dead horses behind him that Hobson could not use. And in order for Hobson to keep up at that same pace, Hobson had to do the same thing. When in Rome, act as the Romans do. Well, that's what that Hobson was learning to do. He was taking civilian horses as well to keep up with Morgan. Unfortunately, Morgan was more than a day ahead of Hobson by the time his now 2,100 troops entered the state. And by Morgan moving fast, he was living off the land, living off civilians, taking food and horses primarily from the civilians, but also taking any other needed items that would wear out, such as saddles, boots, clothes, things that would wear out after riding in the saddle 21 hours every day. Those things wore out very quickly, and you would get holes in the rear of your pants simply after a couple of days of riding, because that's a lot of bouncing around for a cavalryman. Now, also, by doing so, he was covering much ground per day. He was covering on average 40 miles per day, which is about 65 kilometers a day, which is unheard of as a sustained cavalry movement per day. Typical sustained cavalry movements in the Civil War were between 20 and 30 miles a day. not 40 miles a day. So 65 kilometers a day was a major feat in the Civil War for a man on horseback. And they were doing this every day. So it's the speed that's making the difference here, the speed and the movement that Morgan was making. And now the government of Indiana has called out the Indiana militia, called the Indiana Legionnaires after the Roman legionnaires. They were called out. And now Morgan not only has Hobson's 2,500 troops chasing him, now the Indiana Legion sent out 65,000 men to try to capture Morgan's 2,100. But Morgan outruns them all. The Indiana troops they can't chase him down. He's moving so fast, and they can't use effectively the railroad system in Indiana to get troops ahead of him because Morgan's moving so fast, and more importantly, Morgan is using deception to show where he's going to be the next day. And so Union commanders in Indianapolis, which is the capital of Indiana, they are unable to pinpoint where Morgan's going to be that day or even the next day. And therefore, they can't use the railroad system effectively to stop Morgan and get troops ahead of him. They even have regular troops amongst those 65,000. These are veteran troops. They can't get them into position to stop Morgan. So Morgan successfully gets to Harrison, Ohio by July 13th. Now, the largest battle to occur in the state of Indiana during the Civil War is because of Morgan. It's called the Battle of Croydon, occurred on July 9th. And here, the Union militia were the only ones here to be able to stop them. There were 450 Union militia lined up behind rough barricades of stone and fence rails. But after a fight of 30 minutes, Morgan was able to attack and outflank them. And when the artillery opened up on the Union center around where you see the Jordan Guards and the Lawson Gray Rifles in the middle of the Union line there, those men fled immediately because militia weren't trained. They were mostly untrained men from shops and farms, from nearby shops and farms, or they were transported there from other very small towns in Indiana. They were not good soldiers. They were just normal citizens who had come to try to stop Morgan, but they couldn't face veteran troops, and they immediately broke and fled when that artillery opened up. And so this battle lasted 30 minutes. The largest battle in the state of Indiana lasted 30 minutes. And of the 450 Union militia there, 350 of them were captured. And 100 of them basically disappeared into the Indiana hinterlands. And today, this is the battlefield park that looks back at that event. The artillery there is actually pointing in the wrong direction. It looks like it's a Union artillery piece, but the Union militia had no artillery on the battlefield. So that was another reason why that line just dissolved very quickly. Morgan gets to Sunman, Indiana, which is just about 18 miles west of the state of Indiana-Ohio border. And he is there. He's planning his raid around Cincinnati, which is third objective, to get around the largest city in the West for the Union Army. The city of Cincinnati was the primary supply depot in the West, and also even by this time in the Trans-Mississippi. It outdid St. Louis, which was the other large supply depot for the Union Army. Practically all the supplies going to Grant, to the field troops in the Western Theater, which included Burnside and Rosecrans. All those armies were getting supplies from Cincinnati. So Morgan realized this was a great target, but he didn't have enough men by this time. He only had 2,000 men by the time he reached Sunman, Indiana. So he's down 500 men from what he originally started with. He realized the only thing he could do is continue to be the fox, get around Cincinnati as quickly as possible, and avoid Burnside, who was only 27 miles away, roughly about 40 kilometers away. He wasn't very far away, and so Burnside could easily move troops out of Cincinnati and stop Morgan from getting around the city and trap him. And if he gets trapped, Hobson would catch him, which was, of course, Morgan's greatest fear. So here at his headquarters, he decided to move around Cincinnati as quickly as possible. And he met with his subordinates here at this building, which still stands, the American House Hotel. He was on the top floor there in the middle. And he spoke with Johnson and Duke, conferred with them, and said, "We are not going to attack Cincinnati. I've decided we're going to move around the city through the suburbs, what we call Hamilton County, which is the county that contains the city of Cincinnati. And he's going to move through them as quickly as possible, move that through that area as quickly as possible through a night ride, a very dangerous night ride." The businesses here were looted, just like every northern city was looted. Um, the Confederate soldiers were living off the land, so they had to get what they needed, like at Fisher's Leather Store, which is on the far left of this photograph, still stands today. There, Morgan's troops took boots and shoes and saddles, things that they were running out and the soldiers needed to continue on. But they often took things that were unnecessary, like they were taking women's hats and veils and such. They were taking ice skates and bird cages. Why? Because they thought, well, we're going to get through this raid, and we're going to be able to um, get through this raid with no problems. And we're going to take these wonderful things that you can't find in the South, like bird cages and ice skates, and give them to our kids or to our women, where I'm giving them bolts of calico and silk. So they consider them like almost like a traveling gift, like someone that goes on a trip brings a gift back home to their family. That's what they were really trying to do. They were taking advantage of the Union sinistery by doing this. They also moved through enemy territory very much the same throughout the raid, and they did this in Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio. And this map kind of shows how it's done around Cincinnati. You notice that the main column, which is this red line, the red main column line, which is it's solid red, they would move along a certain route, but on each side of that route, the red dashed lines were their flankers. Those flankers were responsible for raiding civilian homes and barns of food, fodder, horses, whatever they needed to move on. And then they would bring that back to the main column who were in need of those things. So they would resupply the division as they moved. It was a fascinating tactic that instead of stopping for the night in a camp to resupply their people, they were eating on the run. They were actually, it's like fast food. They were taking from the civilians, they would eat in the saddle. That's why they were able to ride for 21 hours out of 24 in the saddle, because they were eating in the saddle. They were taking civilian horses for their broken down horses, which would normally break down after 20 or 30 miles. They would need rest. Well, they didn't have time to rest a horse, which could take several hours. So they would replace them with civilian horses. And you notice Hobson, who's behind him, that's the solid blue line. He was doing exactly the same thing. He was splitting them up the same way Morgan was. So now the Union cavalry has learned the tactics that Morgan brought into play, and that would play a big part in the Union victories of the Union cavalry in 64 and 65 of the Civil War. They would take this knowledge and use it in their own way in the raids of the Union Army during the latter part of the Civil War. Now, there was often times when Morgan's men would encounter people from a neutral society like the Shaker Society. They were pacifists, and they would treat them the same way as any Union citizen. They would politely knock on the door, often bow and raise their hat in a salute, and they would ask for where their horses were and may they have some food and drink. And their favorite drink was buttermilk and milk. That was their favorite drink, because they knew if they drank water, there's a good chance they would get sick. And if they got sick, they would be captured by the Union Army, because there's no way they could really travel with a fast moving cavalry division and stay alive. So the Shakers were well treated by Morgan's troops, whereas Later on, the Union troops arrived here and asked the same thing, but instead of being polite about it, they actually raised a gun to the head of the Elder Rubush, who was the leader of the Shaker Society here. Uh, this Union commander from Indianapolis raised a gun to the head of Elder Rubush and said, "You will give me your horses, or else you may not be standing anymore." So this was a good example of where, even though Morgan's troops were often depicted in the newspapers as thieves and um, murderers and rapists, they were not. It was a very strict order throughout Morgan's division that they would not touch any women or children, or they would be shot on spot if they were caught doing so. They were very polite to the women and children, and they would not hurt the men or kill the men they captured unless the men shot back. At that point, the men became enemy soldiers and they had the right to shoot them. But for the most part, there were very few murders along the way, and everybody who was murdered were men who were Union men who were either carrying a gun or who had just really been very vocal in their disdain for the rebels and earned their right to be shot, I think, simply because of the words they said. They often challenged the manhood of some of these rebels. So, yeah, this raid, even though it's depicted as a very nasty raid the Union perspective, um, it is not. Far from it. The soldiers acted very gentlemanly around most of the Union citizens. Um, Petticourt on this night ride around Cincinnati called it the darkest of all nights because it happened to be a night of a new moon, and it was cloudy, and they were ordered not to carry torches. So they groped their way along the dark roads, completely dark, all through the night of July 13th through 14th. And this man remembered it the rest of his life. It was one of the scariest moments in their lives. But they made it around and they resupplied themselves in the morning of July 14th in eastern Hamilton County, just northeast of Cincinnati, and were able to get across the Little Miami River, which you find on the right-hand side of the map. By doing so, they were able to get away from Burnside, who had sent troops by rail across the Hamilton and Dayton Railroad, which you see on the far left. That railroad was one of the busiest railroads in the United States during the Civil War. Thousands and thousands of Union troops would be transported along that railroad from Midwest states, from the eastern states, as well as down to Louisville or Cincinnati to be put on to steamboat transports to be sent down to the front lines. So getting across that Hamilton-Dayton Railroad was a major objective. Morgan crossed there at 2 a.m. on July 14th, crossed that railroad. Not a single Union soldier was there to stop them because Burnside had been deceived so well by this man, Lightning Ellsworth. Lightning Ellsworth, George A. Ellsworth, was a Canadian who had joined the Confederate Army for the fun of it. Well, he was a terrible private. He was a terrible soldier, but Morgan took advantage of a special talent that George Ellsworth brought. George Ellsworth, before the Civil War, had been taught by Samuel Morse, the inventor of the telegraph, personally to use the telegraph. And Ellsworth was an excellent telegrapher, to the point he had a special talent even as a telegrapher. His talent was that he could listen to the tapping rhythm of another telegrapher and learn it just within a couple minutes. And that's important because telegraphy in those days used something called the fist. That tapping rhythm identified you as a certain person. Everybody knew each other's tapping rhythm. Like John's tapping rhythm is different than Steve's tapping rhythm, than Joseph's tapping rhythm. Each person had a different tapping rhythm which identified them by name. Well, Ellsworth could replicate that within minutes. And so when he got on the telegraph to send deceptive messages to the Union Army headquarters, he sounded real. They knew they didn't realize he was an imposter, sending wrong messages to the enemy headquarters. And Ellsworth did that around Cincinnati, right here at the Glendale Depot on the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railroad, which you see on the right. That was an important thing to them. And that weapon is the first use of electronic warfare in world history. Electronic warfare is heavily used today, and every virus we receive, every malware, every phishing message we get, that's electronic warfare today. Ellsworth was one of the pioneers, one of the inventors of electronic warfare. In fact, the London Illustrated Times said it was the greatest invention in warfare that came out of the American Civil War. And Lightning Ellsworth was the man who did it. And so Morgan had that special weapon that he used often in his raids, made him so successful, and that was electronic warfare through the use of the telegraph. Well, Morgan and his officers were just thrilled that they got across the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railroad so easily without a shot being fired that they celebrated at Sharonville on the east side of that railroad. Sharonville had this wonderful 12-mile house, which was a tavern slash hotel, and the keeper of it was a German immigrant, Christopher Meyer, who was also a Copperhead. And for those who are not familiar with the term Copperhead, that's a Southern sympathizer. And he took advantage of this man when he revealed himself as a Southern sympathizer. He offered this, Christopher Meyer offered the best bottle of brandy he could find. And Morgan and his troops immediately knew this man was a Copperhead. But they hated these Copperheads. It's interesting why, because, I'm sorry, because these Southern sympathizers never really helped Morgan as he traveled through Indiana, Ohio. They were all talk and no walk. They said they supported the South, but they didn't help by either joining the division as troops, nor did they help really in giving directions. Most of the time, they hid themselves. And Morgan was so frustrated, and his officers were so frustrated by the lack of action from the Copperheads that they treated them even worse than the Union citizens. And so that's what they did here. They before they left this tavern, Morgan's troops took 2 boxes of cigars and a horse from Christopher Meyer and didn't pay for it. And Christopher Meyer was so upset that he said that he would never support the South again after that day. Now, Morgan did come to this Unionist house, and this is an interesting story I like to share as we wind down here. Morgan's troops came to houses, and as I mentioned, they would bow, knock at the door, they would bow and ask for food and horses. And they did the same here at the Skank House, which is still located, it dates back to 1806. It's still located in Deer Park. And Morgan's scouts came here first and asked those questions. And a lady who was dressed in nurse's garb answered the door. And this lady said, well, I have a sick child in the parlor and you cannot enter the house, which generally Morgan's troops would not do without permission if it was occupied. Morgan, you'll have to stand out in the yard here, in the front yard that you see, and we'll bring you food and water. And we do have 2 bony nags in the barn, but they're not rideable. And sure enough, they checked the barn and the horses were not usable for their purposes. But they did have food and drink out in the front lawn. About 15 minutes later, General Morgan and his entourage arrives, and they're looking for food. It's breakfast time, about 5:30 in the morning on July 14th. And they asked for food, and the Skank women came out and served them food. Well, that parlor where the sick child was located was covered with sheets, which in the Victorian era meant do not enter, it's quarantine. So they all believed there was sick children in that parlor. Well, Morgan's men left there within another 15 minutes. They had to scoot. They had to get out of there as quickly as possible. Hobson was on their trail. They had to get further toward the Little Miami River. So what happened was is inside that parlor, instead of sick children in a bed, there were 4 escaped slaves in the parlor holding down and keeping quiet 2 very expensive stallions who were worth a lot of money and were very rideable. And they were hiding and keeping them quiet the whole time Morgan and his men were out feeding on the front lawn. These horses were on straw on the parlor floor so that their hooves would not make a noise. And it deceived Morgan, and they got away. without losing any of their horses because of this deception. So this was just something where Union citizens were often very, very clever in keeping their valuables from being stolen by Morgan's troops. Now, as Morgan crossed the Miami River, Little Miami River, they had a big camp that they contended with that was very important to the Union. It was called Camp Dennison. It was on the far left, uh, top left there of the map you see. They had to get around that camp because there were several hundred Union troops there, and by that time, several thousand Union militia had joined there at the camp. And so the commander of that camp, Camp Dennison, was the largest camp in the state of Ohio. It was also the eighth largest Union hospital in all the United States. Um, Lieutenant Colonel George Neff was a native of Cincinnati and knew the area very well. His father had been the commander of had been the leader of the Little Miami Railroad. He knew this place inside and out, and he knew how to defend Camp Dennison very well. He was a convalescent officer who had been captured at Battle of Scary Creek in West Virginia, 1862, sent to Libby prison for 14 months. And he was so emaciated by the time he was released that General Burnside made him commander of Camp Dennison, a desk job. Supposed to be an easy job, but it turned out this day it was not. He ended up defending this Camp Dennison as such an important camp for the Union effort from Morgan and his troops, particularly Basil Duke, who attacked the bridge just a mile north of the camp that you see here in the map toward the bottom center. There you will see Neff pulling off an upset, I would say. It's an upset in military fighting because essentially all of Basil Duke's skirmishers were employed in this fight that lasted 3 hours, and all Neff had were 200 militiamen and maybe a dozen or so not very green regular troops under the 11th Ohio Cavalry, a detachment of Company H. These men were definitely not fit to fight veterans, but because of how Neff deployed them along the southern part of the riverbank, they were able to fend off Basil Duke's skirmishers for 3 hours. And then Neff brought in some invalid corps convalescents. These are experienced soldiers who were convalescing at the Camp Dennison General Hospital. He brought them into action by charging across the bridge, this bridge, which is a modernized version of the same bridge that stood on this site. And he charged into the Confederate skirmishers on the side that you see here on the right side with the trees. That charge broke the Confederate skirmish line and forced Basil Duke to retreat from the battlefield. And it was amazing, amazing charge. And one that Neff earned a additional star because of it. He was promoted from lieutenant colonel to colonel 6 days later by General Burnside for that wonderful action and keeping Camp Dennison safe from Morgan and his firebrand. Now, here's an excellent story I like to share. It's Love and War. This often happened throughout the Civil War, but especially on the raid. This happened a few times. Once again, John Anderson, in this case, he was from the 2nd Kentucky Cavalry under Morgan. He knocked at the door with his buddy at the home of the Deer Westers. And the person who answered the door was Catherine Deer Wester, a 30-year-old spinster at that time. And Catherine looked into John's eyes, and John looked into Catherine's eyes, and immediately they fell in love. Love at first sight, truly. And Catherine invited them into the house to give them food. Now, Anderson was ordered to take horses from the Deer Westers, but he told his buddy, we're not taking the horses from the Deer Westers because I plan to marry this girl and I don't want to upset my future father-in-law. So they did not leave with horses. They only left with the food. And he told Catherine after just probably less than a half an hour at most, probably 15 minutes to 20 minutes, he told John as he was leaving the house that I'm going to come back for you, Catherine, if I survive this war. I'm going to marry you. Now, you can imagine what Catherine probably thought, but Catherine felt the same way. There was love at first sight here from both of them. And when John did return after the war, he survived a prisoner of war camp. Came back in 1866, and Catherine married John, and they lived in Ohio for the rest of their lives around Goshen, which is near where the Dear Westers had lived. And they're buried here outside of Miamiville, where the skirmish occurred at the Little Miami River Bridge. Well, the first camp in Ohio that Morgan had was Williamsburg, and is here that Morgan had finished his great ride around Cincinnati. This is the greatest accomplishment of American division of cavalry in American history. It had traveled 85 miles in 35 hours without stopping. No other American mounted infantry division or cavalry division, for that matter, had done that in enemy territory in any time in American history, in any war. So Morgan's troops had accomplished something that was considered unattainable by the time they reached here at Williamsburg. And Morgan was thrilled. He had gotten around his third objective. He had one more objective to make, and that is get across the Ohio River. He went through southern Ohio. You can see his route there along the Ohio, basically running parallel to the Ohio River as he goes across the state. And he hopes to cross the river somewhere above Portsmouth, because Portsmouth at the time of the Civil War was the last port that a steamboat could reach going upstream to Pittsburgh, because of the summer shoals would pop out because of the low water. Well, Morgan knew that and took advantage of that, but unfortunately he did not count on the big rains that occurred after the Battle of Gettysburg that soaked the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia at the Battle of Gettysburg. After that Gettysburg, all that water had to go somewhere. Well, it went into the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers in western Pennsylvania, which fed the Ohio River, and it caused something we today know as the surge. A surge of water traveled down the Ohio River from Pittsburgh down through towns like Wheeling and Marietta, and just happened to hit Buffington Island at Portland within a day before Morgan arrived. And so when Morgan arrived at Portland to cross the Buffington Island ford, he didn't see a ford that his men could cross that was only a foot and a half deep. Instead, it was 6 feet deep because of the surge. And that's what stopped Morgan from crossing the Ohio River. And thus was born the largest battle fought north of the Ohio River. The Battle of Buffington Island was the largest battle fought in the Civil War in the eastern Midwest states and north of the Ohio River. Fought on July 19th. Morgan was pinned here, and allowed, not only did the flood allow troops to be transported for the Union down to Buffington Island to stop Morgan from crossing, but it also allowed the U.S. Navy to get gunboats. Fitch was able to get USS Moose and Allegheny Bell, two heavily armed gunboats, to intervene on the Ohio River to prevent Morgan's troops from crossing or even fording. And that stopped Morgan from crossing the Ohio River on July 19th. His last objective was foiled by none other than Mother Nature. And then that also allowed him to get delayed enough for Hobson to catch up. And Hobson attacked him, and so did Judah, the man who had been Burnside's scapegoat for most of the raid. This is the USS Moose, which got in the middle of the river and fired large rounds of cannonballs. 24-pound Dahlgren rifles were on this, and you can see one of the Dahlgren rifle there right below the 34 on the left at the top of the steamboat. You can see just to the left of the three, you can see a 24-pound Dahlgren battery, and those 24-pound balls are the size of bowling balls. And you can imagine what Morgan's men felt when those things exploded above their heads. It was demoralizing. And they were also suffering from sleep deprivation, having only 3 hours of sleep per night. They were also suffering from lack of ammunition because they had not raided an enemy arsenal on their raid since Lebanon, Kentucky, which was almost 2 weeks earlier. So they were practically out of ammunition for their artillery and also for their rifles. So Morgan was at a great disadvantage in this battle, and they were outnumbered, outgunned, and they had no ammunition to defend themselves. So it was a rout, to say the least. The rout at this battle was complete. It was a 2 hour long battle, running fight that went for nearly 3 miles, and Morgan's troops were decimated here. Basil Duke was captured in this battle right here in this field, and it was Basil Duke's last action before he was considered a prisoner of war. He acted as the rear guard here, and he was captured with 50 other men in the woods in the distance. And so Morgan has lost his best friend, he's lost his right hand man, and he's lost all of his artillery here at the Battle of Buffington Island. He also lost all of his wounded he had carried from Kentucky. They were all captured. It is a complete disaster. Now, Morgan, and also on top of that, most of Morgan's troops tried to escape on their own. They're taught to do that, but most of them were captured by militia or regular troops west of the battlefield, to the point where Morgan, of his original 2,000 men he had in the state of Ohio, he had barely 1,100 men left after this fight. But he was able to get 1,100 men off the field. Mostly, though, they were unarmed or had no ammunition to fight with. So it was a real problem for Morgan. Now he had to find a different way to get across, and he traveled all the way up to a place called Salineville, Ohio, which is barely 130 kilometers or 80 miles from Lake Erie or Canada. That's how far north he got with the remaining men he had. But he only had 400 men by the time he reached, about 475 men in this fight, which is the last battle of the raid, of the skirmish at Salineville. It is the Civil War's northernmost battlefield east of the Mississippi River, fought on July 26th. The same day he would surrender. He lost this fight, lost 75 men. Some sources say 100 men in this fight. So he was down to just about 364 men when he left this battle. And Colonel Kluke was one of his brigade commanders, because Adam Rankin Johnson had successfully escaped after the Battle of Buffington Island. He has successfully escaped into West Virginia. Colonel Kluke took command of the remaining men in that brigade, and he fought a rearguard skirmish here at Salineville to save the Confederate cavalry that were left at a place called West Grove Cemetery. And West Grove Cemetery is the northernmost Confederate battlefield graves in the United States. There is no other city that is north of Salineville that contains Confederate battlefield graves, because these graves are located where they fell. And so when Morgan escaped Salineville, within hours, he was surrounded by Major George W. Rue, the 9th Kentucky Union Cavalry. He was from Ohio, originally from Kentucky, but he lived in Ohio at the time the war broke out. George Rue knew Morgan very well. He had fought Morgan in Kentucky. He had fought him in Tennessee. So Morgan knew Morgan's antics very well. He was able to surround Morgan and force him to surrender before General James Shackelford came up and tried to take the credit. Well, James Shackelford came up at nearly an hour after Rue had caused Morgan to surrender. So Shackelford was not the man who captured Morgan. It was truly George W. Rue, who was a fellow Kentuckian. And very interesting that Morgan would surrender to a fellow Kentuckian. And this is the monument that exists today at the point where Morgan surrendered to George Rue. And so what happened to Morgan? Well, he was sent to the Ohio State Pen, which was illegal at the time of the Civil War for a Confederate soldier or Union soldier to be sent to a actual state prison. But he was not treated as a normal prisoner of war. He was treated as a criminal for what the Northern people considered as a thief, particularly a horse thief, a murderer, and a pillager. So they treated him like that. And they sent also over 60 of his officers to this place to join him. What was interesting, though, is that Morgan and 6 of his officers were able to tunnel out of the state pen on the night of the November 27th, 1863, and get away by wearing civilian clothes, buying a railroad ticket on the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railroad, which was came through. They also had a railroad coming out of Columbus, Ohio, called the Little Miami Railroad, which passed through Camp Dennison. They bought a ticket on the Little Miami that went to the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton, and they passed into Cincinnati, got off the train before it reached the station, paid a kid 50 cents to row them across the Ohio River, and then they used what I call the reversed Underground Railroad, which were Confederate sympathizers in Kentucky and Tennessee, to allow them to get back to Confederate lines. And Morgan was able to get back to Confederate lines just before Christmas of 1863, uh, receiving a hero's welcome in the Confederacy. But of course, the disdain of Bragg and Jefferson Davis. But they couldn't punish him immediately for what he had done on this raid by disobeying orders, because he was so much of a hero to the South for what he had done, something that was considered unfathomable in the South, to be able to invade northern states like they had done. He was a great hero to the South. But unfortunately, he died a year later when he was shot in the back by a Union cavalryman in East Tennessee, the very area that he had helped stop 130,000 troops from entering, particularly the Army of Ohio. It delayed the Army of Ohio by over a month of entering East Tennessee, which prevented the Army of Ohio from participating in the largest battle in the Western Theater, Battle of Chickamauga, Georgia, in September of 1863. It was because of Morgan that the Army of Ohio did not move in the East Tennessee. And that's debatable, of course, but my evidence shows that it was Morgan's raid that stopped the Army of Ohio, not the ninth, not the lack of the um, Ninth Corps troops coming out of Jackson, Mississippi. So that is all I have for you today. Thank you very much.